Hello, I'm Kate Bullard Adams. I'm fairly new to the forest. My husband, Bo Sutterth, and I are still in the middle of what may be the longest move-in ever, and there are many of you that I still haven't met. But looking out over this empty auditorium, I'm imagining those of you whom I have had the pleasure of meeting sitting here with Bo and me today. I'm very grateful to Jo Mauskopf for giving me this chance to read. She suggested that I give some information about myself and my writing, which feels uncomfortably self-promotional. So instead of introducing myself, I'm going to pretend to be someone else, in this case, one of the real writers I've been lucky enough to work with. I thought of Margot Livesey, an incredibly generous teacher and wonderful writer. Her recently published novel, The Boy in the Field, is getting rave reviews. But Margot is from Scotland, and it would be ridiculous for me to try to replicate her beautiful accent. So, for the following introduction, imagine me as Claire Massoud, another incredibly generous teacher and wonderful writer, whose latest book, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write, is also being given a very warm welcome by critics. So I'm now going to take off my glasses and become Claire Massoud for a few minutes. Kate Bullard Adams and her husband, Robert Sutterth, better known as Bo, are newcomers to the forest at Duke. They received the keys to Cottage 10 last December, 15 months after moving to Durham from Charleston, South Carolina, where Kate lived for 35 years. During that time, she received the South Carolina Arts Commission's Fellowship in Prose. Her short stories have been published in a variety of literary journals, and both her short and long fiction have been finalists for numerous awards. Kate will be reading from her novel-length manuscript, Hang Me the Moon, which has been shortlisted for the Faulkner Wisdom Creative Writing Competition. An excerpt was recently named a finalist in the Novel Slices contest. Please join me in welcoming Kate. Thank you, Claire, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to read the first chapter of Hang Me the Moon. Although I've been working on this long-suffering novel, and it really is long-suffering, off and on for 30 years, and have done a number of readings during that time, this will be the very first time I've read from Hang Me the Moon. So for me, this is truly a very special occasion, and I'm very grateful to Jo Mauskopf for making it possible. I'm also very grateful to all of you for watching and listening. Please do remember that Hang Me the Moon is a work of fiction. As is sometimes printed on the copyright page of novels, all incidents and dialogue and all characters, with the exception of some historical and public figures, are products of the author's imagination and are not to be construed as real. There are, however, a few elements of the novel that do happen to coincide with my real life. One is that I am a long ago graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Given the basketball season has just begun, and I'm guessing that there are more of you out there who are Duke alums and fans than Tar Heel loyalists, although Jackie Bruce, if you're watching, I know you're on the right side. Anyway, I hope all of you Blue Devils will overlook the allegiance of our narrator, Phoebe Theos, to her alma mater. Hang Me the Moon, Chapter 1. I saw Suzanne for the first time in the atrium of the A School. I just biked from my apartment, tackling the steep inclines of Charlottesville that came as a shock after Chapel Hill's forgiving slopes. It was the first day of summer school. For me, a pianist, the first day of graduate school in architecture, and Campbell Hall churned with people who seemed to know where they were going. I spotted a sofa in a quiet alcove and sat down with my back turned to this alarming display of purpose. Wiping my face with the sweat-damp bandana that had corralled my hair, I glanced up into the open space that rose from the first floor to the second. Coming down the cantilevered staircase was a woman, about my age, I guessed. She was looking down, her hair falling across her face like a slick black scrim. A scoop-neck dress showed off a silver necklace and an early summer tan. And as she and the dress got closer, I felt a jolt, as if the sofa had jumped. Her dress was just like one of mine, a favorite that I'd only parted with a few months earlier when the fabric began to fray. Seeing its twin might not have been so strange had the dress not been so unusual. It was reversible, one side a solid black, the other a burst of bright colors. I'd almost always worn it with the black side out, but this stranger had chosen to dazzle the world with turquoise and fuchsia and bold streaks of green. I looked from the dress up to her face, no longer hidden by hair, and I felt another jolt. Suzanne was beautiful. Later, I would say it was her high forehead and her hair, her bold eyebrows and sharp cheekbones that made her so memorable. At the time, I simply felt the impact of her presence. I have never seen anyone who looked more energetic and alert, more alive. I sank into the sofa. What would I have given to slip from my skin into hers, an eye-pleasing carapace of poise and self-confidence? My fingers tapped my legs, searching for a keyboard they couldn't find. A few hours later, I found myself clustered around a drawing board with Suzanne and the other 8 members of our class. I was surprised that there were as many women as men. It was 1973, and UVA had only started admitting women a few years earlier. All eyes were on Hunter, the head of the department and our instructor for the summer studio, a 9-week program meant to make up for our lack of undergraduate degrees in design. I'd met him once before when I'd come for my interview and had been as unnerved then as now by his pallor, by the absence of color in his face and his voice and his all-white wardrobe. Hunter lit a cigarette. Everybody found the supply shop, you're all settled. After quick introductions, we'd spent the morning staking out our space, each of us claiming a table for newly purchased drawing boards and a drawer in one of the flat file cabinets for the rest of our equipment. Then here's your first assignment, he said. You've got the afternoon to come up with 3 designs, any kind of designs, using any kind of materials. Tomorrow morning, we'll have our first jury. My knee twitched. Any questions? What's a design, was my frantic thought. But I wasn't about to ask the obvious and run the risk of humiliating myself. The word jury had reminded me what that felt like. One of the younger men, whose Blue Devil t-shirt suggested he was a graduate of my alma mater's arch rival, Duke, raised his hand. Are these supposed to be building designs, like floor plans or something? Hunter shrugged. Any kinds of designs, any kind of materials. He paused. Anyone else? Silence. Then get started. He tapped his cigarette in a stray styrofoam cup, then strolled towards the stairwell. A pair of red striped socks winked as he walked. Any idea what we're supposed to do? Asked one of the older men when Hunter was out of earshot. Shoot first, aim later. A woman with strawberry blonde braids fired the pistol of her thumb and index finger. Bullseye. There was a ripple of laughter, and we all looked at Suzanne, whose name I'd made note of during introductions. For the first time, I was close enough to really see her eyes. They were an unusual shade of lavender blue, made more striking by the contrast with her hair. It was hard not to stare. After a few more murmurs of protest, the 10 of us went our separate ways. I drifted to my drawer and pulled it open, staring at the tangle of equipment inside. A T-square and scales, French curves and triangles, a bewildering array of instruments I didn't know how to play. A red metal tackle box held smaller items that were just as intimidating. Pincer-tipped lead holders, roll-topped containers of leads, 314 pencils, Prismacolors, a lettering guide, an X-Acto knife. Then there was paper, a roll of yellow trace and an orange tube of vellum. I took the paper and the tackle box to my desk. At Chapel Hill, I'd majored in music and spent long, secluded hours in the basement of Hill Hall, a cozy rabbit warren of practice rooms where it was just the piano and me. The studio was a different world, a single open space with no partitions or doors and no way of hiding whatever you might or might not be doing from everyone else. In this case, everyone else seemed to be busy. The Vassar graduate, whose world-weary slouch matched her Ivy League degree, sat in a bay window, twirling her compass in smooth pirouettes. The fellow with the stammer that reminded me of mine in nursery school was putting together his rapidograph pens. Suzanne had lined up her markers and had already started drawing, her arm moving in bold, confident strokes across a large piece of vellum. My hands went limp, as helpless as they'd been during that misery of months when they forgot how to play the piano, when they forced me to look for a future that didn't involve a keyboard. The woman sitting across from me, the one with the strawberry blonde braids, caught my eye. "Got any tape?" I dug through my tackle box, held up a roll. She walked over. "I'll bring it right back. I'm terrible on names." "Phoebe," I said. She smelled like peanut butter. "And you're Lise." The morning's introductions came back to me, short for Elise. She smiled, her face a warm field of freckles. As she left, my fingers added furor, drumming against the drawing board as if playing the opening E's and D sharps of that rite of passage piece. Beneath them, taped to my Borco board cover, was the Goethe quote, "Architecture is frozen music." Dr. Benke, my piano professor at UNC, had inscribed it on the graduation card he'd given me just a month earlier. I cut off a piece of vellum, picked up a black felt pen, and started drawing staves. The first was horizontal, the next a perpendicular overlap. I began stretching them out, shrinking them up, crisscrossing and angling them, trying to create some sort of pleasing pattern. I jumped, slashing the staves with a lightning bolt of black ink. Hunter stood at my shoulder. "Sorry," he said, his voice as cool as the gray of his eyes. "Just making the rounds." I forced myself to look with him at the tangle of spidery lines now highlighted by the black blotch he'd brought about. My head filled with static, like a radio stuck between stations. "It's hard to know where to start." "I can imagine," he said. "Music majors aren't the norm here." I froze. Hunter had given the words no inflection, but I heard them as a pointed reminder of the fact he'd made quite clear in my admissions interview. "We've had some long shots in the program," he said, mentioning an ornithologist and a divinity school graduate, "but this is the first application we've ever had to play on the piano." As evidence of creative work, I'd submitted several short compositions from a theory class. They were imitative exercises in the styles of famous composers. Nothing original, but they were the best I could do. Yes, I was a long shot, and no, I was not the norm. I had no response. "Keep an eye on your time," Hunter finally said, tapping the face of his watch. Veins the color of lichen ridged the back of his hand. He pulled his cigarettes, Pall Malls, from his pocket, then moved on. My nose was sweating, and I felt wavy, like a sheet being shaken out in slow motion. "Keep going," I whispered. I hid the staves I never wanted to see again under my drawing board, dug the 314 pencils out of my tackle box. Like a first grader, I ground them to a point at the wall-mounted sharpener. Then I cut off a piece of yellow trace. Something about the pencil's sepia color reminded me of a rug in my parents' living room. I began trying to recreate the geometric quality of its design, the angular, elongated figures. As the lead settled onto the paper, its point wore down to a bevel that could vary the width and weight of the lines. Even though the drawing was little more than a smudged blur, I felt more comfortable than I had with the pen. I'd almost started to relax, to think about something other than the tension that knotted my neck, when a laugh jarred the room. Suzanne was smiling up at Hunter, who was looking at her work. Even from a distance, I could see its bold, colorful composition. My mother's colors, I realized, the colors of poppies and birds of paradise, a foreign palette to eyes attuned to the black and white of keyboards. Pointing with animation to one area of the drawing, Suzanne said something I couldn't make out. I couldn't hear Hunter's reply either, and his face was still an impassive mask. But at a minimum, Suzanne hadn't been scared into silence, and I had to think that her striking appearance, combined with that of her drawings, made some kind of impression on Hunter. I cut off the piece of trace that now looked like a shapeless gray smear and hid it with the staves. Faced by the drawing board's blank stare, I was paralyzed by the same panic I'd felt when I admitted my failure in music. Then I remembered what my father had said when I told my parents that I wasn't going to continue with the piano. I tried to be matter of fact, to pretend that it was no big deal. But when the time came, I started to cry, hard. And it only got worse when I saw their expressions of startled concern, their reflexive glances at the picture of me and Aunt Minnie holding the blue ribbon I'd won in an early piano competition. Then my father, a surgeon, wrapped a purposeful hand around mine. "Phoebe," he said, "nobody's gonna die." "Nobody's gonna die," I repeated silently. I looked at the wall clock. Only 25 minutes left. I wiped my hands on my shorts. On one side, I felt the lump of my Swiss Army knife. On the other, the wadded trash from the popsicle I'd eaten for breakfast. I positioned the orange-stained popsicle sticks on the table. I pulled out my knife and began to cut. As quickly as I could, I sliced each stick into narrow strips, then cut the strips in half. On a piece of cardboard, I laid out the strips and glued them in a matrix. I didn't give myself time to think, didn't try to second-guess my hands. I just let them work, subdividing some spaces, leaving others open, gluing in a fragment of the polka-dotted wrapper here and there. My hands were still in motion when Hunter called time and told us to pin up our designs in the conference room. As paper rustled and drawers thumped, I raced to glue the last few strips in place. By the time I got to the conference room, the walls were almost full. The only space left was in a corner next to Suzanne. The two drawings she'd already put up, one a dramatic massing of black rectangles against a turquoise background, the other, thick bands of bright colors aligned in a loose basket weave, dominated the room. I felt humiliated just walking towards them. "Okay if I squeeze in?" I avoided any eye contact. "Sure." Fumbling with my designs, I dropped a pushpin. "Here, let me help." "Go away," I wanted to say. "Leave me and my miserable drawings alone." "Thanks," I answered. Suzanne began handing me pins. "What did you use for this one?" she asked when I got to the popsicle collage. "Oh, geez." I did my best to explain my act of desperation. Expecting a reflection of my own misgivings, I saw instead an expression of lively interest. "Nice," she nodded. "Really nice, Phoebe." She remembered my name. I gave up a little of my jealous grudge. "But look at yours. You must have done some of this before." She shrugged. "My mother's got an advertising agency. I've spent a little time there." "That's it, everybody out," Hunter announced. My eyes swerved from the warmth of Suzanne's work to his icy pallor. "See you here at 9 tomorrow." When I turned around, Suzanne was gone. Back in the studio, I cleaned the debris from my desk, then put my tackle box and paper away, securing my drawer with a lock I'd used in Hill Hall. There, it had guarded music and metronomes, and for a second I squeezed it tight, felt the comfort of its familiar weight. Then I went to my table and picked up my backpack. Only when I turned to leave the studio, taking a final glance at its dreary disarray, did I realize the accuracy of the vantage point I'd chosen. When Hunter had told us to choose our tables that morning, I'd simply claimed the closest one. But from the start, intuition had known where I belonged. I'd positioned myself quite precisely with my back against the wall. I was starved. Lunch had been only some crackers and a tab, and I walked down the drive that led from the upper parking lot to Rugby in search of food. The fraternity houses along the way were mercifully empty. When I'd come for my interview back in January, the semester had been underway, and the same route had been a gauntlet of wolf whistles and, "Hey, babies," an uncomfortable reminder that the Cavaliers were still getting used to co-eds. Going there as a freshman hadn't been an option for me and my collegiate classmates. Mary Washington was the separate but equal alternative. "Just ignore them," the female grad student who'd shown me around the A school had said as she guided me past the rowdy rubberneckers. "There are a few morons, but most of the guys are okay. Just don't expect to see any female professors around." That was nothing new. With the exception of a flutist who taught music history, there hadn't been any at UNC either, and men outnumbered women in all but my music classes. "Hey, wait up," a voice called. It was Suzanne, along with another of our classmates, Fielding. In the studio, their banter had made it clear they already knew each other, and I wondered what the connection was, girlfriend and boyfriend, or just friends? Given Fielding's exceptional good looks, the broad stretch of his shoulders, the hazel eyes made greener by a teal t-shirt, the first seemed a definite possibility, but their low-key interaction suggested otherwise. They invited me to join them for dinner. My yes was immediate. The three of us continued on through the sweat of early evening air, the ice-white dome of the rotunda rising like a mirage to the west. We ended up on a small side street called Elliewood Avenue. Almost at its end was a Victorian house with a noticeable list and a hand-painted sign that said simply, "Tunas." Suzanne, her hair swishing like a black slip, led us in. A foyer opened into a large room full of conversation and laughter and the smell of rosemary. "Got room for three, Celine?" Suzanne asked. "Always," the young woman answered. With long, silky strides, she led us to a corner table. "She danced with Alvin Ailey for 2 years," Suzanne whispered. In a minute, Celine was back with pitchers of water and iced tea and a small bowl of muddled sugar that brought a smile to my face. I thought my mother was the only person who still made muddled sugar. Mom considered it the only way to sweeten iced tea and used a special wooden spoon to mash the sugar, mint, and a little warm water together. "Not as long as I'm around." A tall man smiled down at us, his dark skin gleaming with sweat. "How's everybody doing? Miss Suzanne, Fielding?" He nodded at each of them as he wiped his hands on his apron and his forehead on his sleeve. His profile was the Indian head on a nickel, that same small bump at the top of the nose. "Phoebe, meet Tuna," Suzanne said. His braids grazed the table as he leaned across to shake hands. On his wrist was the blister of a burn. Tuna slipped into a few minutes of small talk with Suzanne and Fielding, a quick catch-up that suggested they hadn't seen each other for a while. As they chatted, I looked around the room, its wooden floors and white walls lit by the late afternoon sun angling through large panes of old, wavy glass. The openness of the space suggested the outdoors, and the soft stir of the ceiling fans and the Queen Anne's lace and daisies on the tables gave the feel of a picnic, of fine dining al fresco. I took a deep breath, imagined the smell of new-mown grass. Freed from the drawing board, my eyes roamed the walls, scanning the display of artwork. I stood up to look at the nearest piece. It was a photographic collage, an edgy, intricate combination of the real and the imagined. The limbs of bodies mixed with the limbs of trees. Human faces juxtaposed with jack-o'-lanterns in a pumpkin patch. Rifles rising with corn stalks in a grim reaper's field. "Pretty cool, huh?" Fielding said. A shaving nick accented the cleft in his chin. It's wonderful. I peered at a prowling tiger that carried a human baby like a kitten in its mouth. Who's the artist? Right here, said Suzanne, patting Tuna's arm. I nodded in admiration. You do this and the restaurant? He gazed around the room, a canvas of contentment at odds with the disquiet on the walls. Seems folks like my cooking better than my art, he said with a wry smile, but thanks for your interest. So what's on the menu tonight? Fielding asked. Tuna rested his hands on the back of Suzanne's chair. Let's see now, he began, and a dreamy haze drifted across his face as he described watercress soup, corn cakes with Smithfield ham, chicken pot pie, and blackberry cobbler. Listening to this mouth-watering recital, Suzanne tilted her head back against Tuna's waist. He stepped to the side. Celine will be right over to take your orders. Holler if you need anything. With a smile and a tug of his apron, he walked away. A few minutes later, Celine appeared with a bottle of wine. Compliments of the chef, she said, holding it up for review. Suzanne did a token testing, then Celine finished pouring. Here's to Hunter, Fielding said, raising his glass. May he soon see our genius. And may he go blind in the meantime, Suzanne added. We laughed and started on the rosemary cornbread, then the artfully presented food that Celine set before us. For a little while, I remembered what it felt like to have fun. I learned that Suzanne had graduated a year earlier with a art history degree from Mary Washington and had been working since as a cocktail waitress in Charlottesville. The fox and hound, the mousetrap, she said with a shrug. Quick bucks. Fielding had an engineering degree from UVA, and after a year with the local firm, had decided he didn't want to spend the rest of his life calculating loads and stresses. How about you, Phoebe? How'd you end up here? Fielding asked. The question hung in the air. Art history, engineering, those were logical lead-ins to architecture. But music? I put down my fork. I studied piano, I began, but I just hit a wall. And when I thought about other things I like to do, it was a struggle to explain my leap of faith. I realized I like to make things. There'd been the model of the Pont du Gard for my 8th grade Latin project, the grape arbor that Dad and I built for Mom's 40th birthday. I heard about this program, my eyes rose to see the ceiling fan, its swirling mandala, and here I am. Neat, said Fielding. I get it, said Suzanne. Keyboards, drawing boards. I felt a zing, a little pop. I never thought of that, I said, looking at her. Any link between my past and my present was a comfort. Thanks. She flicked her fingers in the air, a gesture of largesse. Anytime. To my relief, the conversation moved on. It was easy to ask Suzanne and Fielding questions about Charlottesville to see what they knew about the A School. Their occasional mention of someone named Reed suggested that he was a key player in whatever their relationship was. And the things they didn't know about each other's recent lives suggested that any romantic connection they might have had was history. That discovery added an extra dimension to the evening. It made it more fun to make eye contact with Fielding, to enjoy the occasional knock of his knee against mine. And the wine that he kept pouring in my glass and the Billie Holiday record that kept playing in the background made it easy for fantasy to take a seat in the empty 4th chair at our table. We were close to finishing when Tuna reappeared. Everything delicious, he asked, and his face shone as we answered with superlatives. Tuna, Suzanne said, you got any hair cutting time next week? My eyes jumped from her to him. Well now, he folded his arms and tipped his head to the side. It's been a while since you turned me loose on your hair. He paused as if waiting for her to take some kind of bait. Her face reddened. That seemed to satisfy him, and he said, I could come over Friday, I suppose. They settled on a time, then Tuna said his goodbyes and started back towards the kitchen. Tuna cuts hair too? I watched him pause at another table full of smiling faces. It's fun, Suzanne answered. He just packs up his scissors and comes to wherever you live. Maybe I'll give him a call. I tugged at some stray strands that had drifted over my shoulder. I could use a trim. Why don't you just come over on Friday, she said. You don't think he'd mind? She looked at the heat-waved wildness of my hair and laughed. Nothing he'd like better. For the first time since I got into Charlottesville, I felt a hum of anticipation, the pleasure of looking forward to something. I thanked Suzanne and reached for the one swallow of wine left in my glass. On the way out, I stopped in the bathroom. As I washed my hands, I looked in the mirror and saw Suzanne's face looking over my shoulder. I smiled even as I realized it was a photograph hanging on the wall behind me. I turned to take a closer look. Tuna, I assumed, had taken it, but unlike the pictures in the dining room, this was a clear, straightforward shot. Even so, the Susanna portrayed looked different from the one who stood outside. Her hair was longer and pulled loosely back from her face, and she must not have been wearing any makeup because the photograph revealed a chink in her perfection. Visible across the lower part of her left cheek, like the seal of an envelope, was the thin line of a scar. She was wearing the same dress she had on that day, the one that was like mine, but in the photo, Suzanne wore it with the black side out, a change that added to the simplicity of her appearance. She looked younger with a softness in her face that was missing in the person I just had dinner with. The photograph couldn't have been that old, but it seemed to have captured her when she was still a girl, before she turned the corner that leaves barrettes and charm bracelets behind. I reached up to the picture, traced the faint line across her cheek. Every scar tells a story, my father always said. At that moment, I was sure Suzanne's was one of crowd-pleasing success, of the girl who had it all. Talent and beauty, charisma and accomplishment, all the qualities I yearned for. How eager I was to write Suzanne's story for her. It was much easier to do that than to write my own. Thank you very much.